The final stitch pulled taut, a small, perfect pearl anchoring the frayed lace of her mother's wedding glove. Lady Elara Ainsworth held it up to the waning afternoon light, slanting through the tall, grimy window of her bedchamber. The glove, once a pristine ivory, was now the color of old cream, a delicate ghost of a happier time. It was the only thing of true value she had left to mend. Everything else, her family's name, their fortune, her own future, was torn beyond any stitch she could master. A chill, more profound than the late autumn air, seeped into the room. It was the chill of inevitability. Downstairs in her father's study, a conversation was taking place that would seal her fate. She was not privy to its particulars, but she understood its substance. She was the final asset of the once proud Ainsworth estate, a baronetcy bled dry by her father's insatiable appetite for the gaming tables. She was the lamb being led to market, and the only question that remained was the name of the buyer. Her maid Anna entered without knocking, her face a mask of anxious sympathy. "My lady," she whispered, her hands twisting a corner of her apron. "Your father, he requests your presence." Elara placed the glove carefully into a small rosewood box, its velvet lining worn thin. She did not look at Anna. If she did, the carefully constructed dam of her composure might crack. "Of course. Is the visitor still with him?" "He is, my lady, the Duke of Blackwood." The name landed in the silent room like a block of ice. The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair Beaumont, a man spoken of in hushed, fearful tones throughout the drawing rooms of London. A man of immense wealth and power, owner of vast, forbidding estates in the north. A man who had appeared in society 2 years ago, a widower cloaked in a grief so profound and so cold it seemed to freeze the very air around him. He was a creature of shadow and rumor, a dark prince in a fairy tale gone wrong. And he was in her father's study. Elara rose, her spine as straight as the iron resolve she had forged in the fires of her family's decline. She smoothed the worn fabric of her grey wool dress, a garment more suited to a governess than a lady of her station. There was no point in pretending to be something she was not. The Duke would see through any artifice. He would see the threadbare carpets, the water stains on the ceiling, the desperate poverty clinging to the house like ivy. He would see her, the daughter, the final desperate gambit. As she descended the grand, decaying staircase, the wood groaning under her slippers, she could hear the low murmur of voices, her father's, obsequious and thin, and another, a voice like the grinding of stone, low and devoid of warmth. She paused at the study door, her hand hovering over the tarnished brass knob. She took a single steadying breath, summoning an image of her younger brother Thomas at his school, his tuition fees the most immediate and pressing of the debts. For him, she would do this. For her mother's memory, she would endure this. She opened the door and stepped inside. The room was dark, heavy with the scent of stale pipe smoke and despair. Her father, Sir Reginald Ainsworth, a man shrunken by his own failings, shot to his feet, a weak, ingratiating smile plastered on his face. "Elara, my dear, his Grace was just remarking on the fine portrait of your grandmother." Elara's gaze slid past him, past the portrait with its peeling varnish, to the man standing before the hearth. The Duke of Blackwood was taller than she had imagined, a figure of stark, imposing lines. His black coat was exquisitely tailored, a slash of midnight against the room's gloom. His hair was as dark as his coat, his features severe, as if carved from granite. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, arctic grey, and they surveyed her with an unnerving, dispassionate intensity, as if she were a horse he was considering for purchase. There was no kindness in them, no interest, only assessment. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady as she executed a perfect curtsy. She had been taught that dignity was a lady's final armor. She would not let it fall. The Duke inclined his head, a gesture so slight it was almost an insult. "Miss Ainsworth." The title was a deliberate jab. He knew she was a lady. "Elara," her father twittered nervously. "His Grace has made a most generous proposal." Alistair Beaumont's gaze did not leave her face. "I have made an offer, Sir Reginald. Its generosity is a matter of perspective." He spoke directly to Elara, his voice a low baritone that vibrated with power and a chilling lack of emotion. "I require a duchess. I require a mother for my daughter. I require a woman of impeccable breeding and quiet disposition to manage my household. Your father assures me you possess these qualities." He paused, and the silence stretched, thick with unspoken meaning. Elara felt the weight of his scrutiny, the cold calculation in it. He was not looking for a wife. He was hiring for a position. "In return for your services," the Duke continued, his tone flat and businesslike, "I will settle your father's extensive debts. I will provide a generous settlement that will ensure his comfort and fund your brother's education and any subsequent career he may choose. You will want for nothing, materially. Your duties will be to oversee the running of Blackwood Manor, to act as hostess when required, which will be infrequently, and to provide a respectable maternal influence for my daughter Rose." He took a step closer, and Elara had to fight the instinct to retreat. The air around him felt frigid. Let me be unequivocally clear, Lady Alara. This will be a marriage in name and in law only. I do not offer affection, nor do I require it. My heart is not a part of this transaction. My life has no more room for sentiment. You will have your own wing of the manor. You will have your freedom within the bounds of propriety, but you will not be my companion, my confidant, or my lover. You will be the Duchess of Blackwood. A title, a role, nothing more. Do you understand the terms? The sheer, brutal honesty of it was a slap in the face. He was not even pretending to offer a semblance of a normal marriage. He was offering a gilded cage, a loveless prison in exchange for her family's salvation. Her father was watching her, his eyes pleading, his face slick with sweat. She thought of Thomas, his bright, hopeful letters from school, full of dreams she could not bear to see extinguished. She looked back at the Duke, at the frozen landscape of his face, the bleak emptiness in his eyes. He was a man hollowed out by some private sorrow, and he was offering to share that hollowness with her. She lifted her chin, her own gaze as direct and unflinching as his. This was not a proposal of marriage. It was a contract for survival, and she would survive. I understand the terms perfectly, Your Grace, Elara said, her voice clear and cold as a winter bell. When is the wedding? The journey north was a silent, somber affair. They were married by special license in a dusty, empty London church, with only her father and the Duke's solicitor as witnesses. The Duke had placed a heavy gold band on her finger, his touch brief and impersonal, as cold as the metal itself. He had not spoken a single word to her that was not strictly necessary. Now they sat opposite each other in his perfectly sprung carriage as it thundered through the darkening countryside, the rhythmic drumming of the horses' hooves, a monotonous beat counting down the miles to her new life. Elara kept her gaze fixed on the window, watching the rolling green hills of the south give way to the starker, more dramatic landscapes of the north. The sky had turned a bruised purple, and a fine misting rain had begun to fall, blurring the world outside into a watercolor of grey and green. The weather seemed a perfect reflection of her own spirit, muted, melancholic, and deeply uncertain. The Duke had not spoken since they had left the last coaching inn. He sat with a book open on his lap, though Elara had not seen him turn a page in over an hour. His face, in the carriage's gloom, was a study in stillness. The hard lines of his jaw, the straight bridge of his nose, the unyielding set of his mouth, he looked like a statue dedicated to some forgotten, tragic hero. She wondered, not for the first time, about the woman who had put that look on his face, the first Duchess of Blackwood, Isabella. Her death was a matter of public record, a carriage accident 2 years prior, but the details were sparse, shrouded in the Duke's impenetrable silence. What had she been like? Was she beautiful? Was she loved? The Duke's stark declaration that he had no heart left to give suggested she had been. The thought sent a strange, unwelcome pang through Elara. It was not jealousy, not exactly. How could she be jealous of a ghost she had never known, for the affections of a man she did not want? It was more a profound sense of sadness for the life this man must have once had, a life so full of light that its absence had plunged him into permanent darkness. Her new home, when it finally appeared through the mist and gathering dusk, did little to lift her spirits. Blackwood Manor was not a house, it was a fortress, a vast Gothic edifice of dark grey stone that seemed to rise organically from the wind-swept moorland. Turrets and towers clawed at the sky, and hundreds of windows stared out like vacant eyes. A sense of profound ancient melancholy clung to the very stones. It was less a home and more a mausoleum. As the carriage drew to a halt before the massive oak doors, they swung open, spilling a weak yellow light onto the gravel drive. A line of servants stood assembled in the grand entrance hall, their faces stiff and unwelcoming. At their head was a severe-looking woman in a black dress, her grey hair pulled into a tight, unforgiving bun. The Duke alighted first, not waiting to assist her. Elara gathered her skirts and followed, stepping out into the cold, damp air. She felt the eyes of the staff on her, a collective, silent judgment. Mrs. Davies, the Duke's voice cut through the silence. This is the Duchess. See to her needs. He did not introduce Elara to Mrs. Davies. He announced her as one might announce the arrival of a piece of furniture. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, gave a short, sharp curtsy, her eyes flicking over Elara with an expression that was not quite contempt, but certainly not warmth. Your Grace. Her voice was as starched as her collar. Alistair turned to Elara, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Davies is my housekeeper. She will show you to your rooms. We will dine in 1 hour, separately. Your meals will be brought to your receiving room. And with that, he turned on his heel and strode down a long, dark corridor, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor until he was swallowed by the shadows. He had not even welcomed her to his home. He had delivered her to it like a parcel. Ilara stood alone in the cavernous hall, the silence of the assembled servants pressing in on her. She felt small, insignificant, an unwelcome ghost in a house already full of them. "If your grace will follow me," Mrs. Davies said, her tone making it clear it was an order, not a request. Ilara followed the housekeeper up a sweeping staircase, her hand trailing on the cold, polished wood of the banister. Portraits of grim-faced ancestors watched her progress, their painted eyes seeming to follow her with disapproval. The wing Mrs. Davies led her to was in the east of the manor, far from the central hub of the house. It was a self-contained suite of rooms, a large, beautifully appointed bedchamber, a sitting room with a small fireplace and a dressing room. The furnishings were elegant but impersonal, like a suite in a fine hotel. It was clear they had been prepared for her, but they held none of the warmth of a lived-in space. "Your maid, Anna, has already unpacked your things," Mrs. Davies stated, her hands clasped tightly before her. "A footman will bring your dinner at 8. Is there anything else, Your Grace?" Ilara looked around the opulent, lonely room. I should like to meet Lady Rose." A flicker of something, surprise, disapproval, crossed the housekeeper's face before it was smoothed away. "Lady Rose is sleeping. The child keeps to a strict schedule." "Then I shall meet her in the morning," Ilara said, her voice gentle but firm. She would not be relegated to a distant wing and treated as an irrelevance. She was the Duchess now. And more importantly, she was meant to be a mother to a little girl. That, at least, was a part of her contract she intended to honor in spirit as well as in letter. Mrs. Davies gave another stiff curtsy. "As your grace wishes," she departed, closing the door with a soft but decisive click, leaving Ilara utterly alone in the echoing silence of Blackwood Manor. Ilara walked to the window and pushed aside the heavy velvet curtains. The rain had stopped, and a sliver of moon cast a pale, ethereal light over the grounds. In the distance she could see the dark, tangled shape of what might have once been a formal garden. Everything seemed to be sleeping, or perhaps dying, under a blanket of neglect, just like the man she had married. She let the curtain fall, plunging the room back into shadow. This was her new life, a cold truce in a house of sorrows. She had made her bargain. Now she had to find a way to endure it. The days that followed settled into a monotonous, chillingly polite routine. Ilara woke, breakfasted alone in her sitting room, and then was left to her own devices. The house was a labyrinth of silent corridors and closed doors. The staff moved like wraiths, whispering in corners and falling silent whenever she approached. They were polite, efficient, and utterly impenetrable, their loyalty clearly belonging to the ghost of the first Duchess and the grim master of the house. Alistair was a phantom presence. She would sometimes hear his heavy tread in a distant corridor or catch a glimpse of him crossing the great hall, always dressed for riding or heading to his study. A place she had already learned was forbidden territory. They never spoke. Their paths were designed not to cross. The vastness of the manor made it easy to maintain the fiction that they were merely two strangers lodging under the same roof. Her first meeting with Rose was a carefully stage-managed event. The girl was brought to Ilara's sitting room by her governess, Missy Albright, a nervous young woman with frightened eyes. Rose was a small, delicate child of 5, with her father's dark hair but wide, watchful eyes the color of violets. She was dressed in a pristine white frock and stood clutching a small, worn-out rag doll, as if it were a shield. "Lady Rose," the governess prompted gently, "say good day to the Duchess." Rose looked at Ilara, her gaze unnervingly solemn for a child so young. She did not speak, she simply stared, her expression a mixture of curiosity and deep, abiding sadness. Ilara knelt, bringing herself to the child's level. She ignored the governess and spoke directly to Rose, her voice soft. "Hello, Rose. That's a very beautiful doll. What is her name?" The child's grip on the doll tightened. She glanced at her governess, then back at Ilara, and finally whispered so quietly Ilara could barely hear it. "Lily?" "Lily," Ilara repeated with a warm smile. "That's a lovely name. I am Ilara. It's very nice to meet you both." She did not press further. She did not try to touch the child or force a conversation. She simply met the little girl where she was, in her silent, watchful world. The visit lasted a stiff, formal 15 minutes before Miss Albright whisked the child away. This became their daily ritual, a brief, stilted meeting in Ilara's rooms. Ilara learned that Rose rarely spoke, that she did not play with other children, and that she spent most of her days in the nursery wing with her governess, a world away from her father's study and Ilara's east wing. The child was as isolated as Ilara was, a small, lonely satellite in the cold, empty orbit of Blackwood Manor. Frustrated by the suffocating inertia of the house, Ilara began to explore. She walked the long corridors, her footsteps the only sound, tracing the patterns in the thick dust that lay upon unused furniture. She discovered a magnificent library, its shelves groaning with thousands of books, but its air stale and uncirculated. And she discovered the West Wing. The doors to it were not locked, but they were firmly closed. A palpable sense of stillness and sorrow emanated from the corridor. When she asked Anna about it, the young maid, who had quickly become her only confidant, grew pale. "That was the old nursery wing, my lady," Anna whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if the walls might be listening, "where the first Duchess and the baby—" Her voice trailed off. An infant son. Ilara had not known. The public accounts had only mentioned his wife. The grief that haunted this house suddenly felt heavier, its dimensions deeper and more terrible. This was not just a widower's sorrow, it was a father's. The closed wing was a shrine to a loss so profound it had to be sealed away from the light. Ilara felt a wave of compassion for the cold, distant man she had married, a feeling so sharp and unexpected it startled her. She retreated from the West Wing, a silent respect for its sorrow holding her back. Her explorations took her outside instead. The grounds were as vast and neglected as the house. The lawns were overgrown, the paths choked with weeds, and there, just as she had glimpsed from her window on that first night, was the ruin of a magnificent garden. It was enclosed by a high brick wall, a crumbling wooden door hanging from a single rusty hinge. Inside, nature had run riot. Weeds grew thick and tall, strangling what must have once been meticulously planned flower beds. A central fountain was choked with moss and dead leaves. But through the chaos, Ilara could see the bones of what it had been. She could see the ghostly outlines of paths, the skeletal remains of climbing roses clinging to a rotting trellis, a stone bench half swallowed by ivy. She found one of the undergardeners, a gnarled old man named Silas, attempting to tame a patch of weeds near the stable block. His hands were stained with earth, and his face was a roadmap of wrinkles. "The old rose garden," he mumbled when she asked him about it, not quite meeting her eye. He, like the rest of the staff, seemed wary of her. "Aye, that were Her Grace's pride and joy, the first Her Grace." He said it without malice, but the distinction was clear. "Spent all her time in there, knew every rose by name. Ain't no one set foot in there since the accident. His Grace gave the order, said to let it be. Let it be. Let it die, just like everything else in this house." Ilara looked at the tangled wilderness, and for the first time since arriving at Blackwood, she felt not despair but a flicker of purpose. It was a mirror of the house, of its master's heart, once beautiful, now abandoned to grief and decay. But it was not dead. The roots were still there, dormant, waiting. She made a decision. It was a quiet, internal resolution, a small act of rebellion against the oppressive gloom. She would not let it be. The next morning, Ilara did not wait for Rose to be brought to her. She went to the nursery. Miss Albright looked flustered and alarmed by the breach of protocol, but Ilara paid her no mind. She smiled at Rose, who was sitting at a small table, listlessly arranging wooden blocks. "Good morning, Rose," Ilara said brightly. "I was wondering if you and Lily would like to help me with a secret project." The word secret was a small piece of magic. Rose's solemn eyes widened slightly. She looked at Ilara, then at her doll, and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Ilara asked a footman for a pair of sturdy gardening gloves and a trowel, a request that was met with baffled silence but was eventually fulfilled. She changed out of her morning dress and into a simple, dark-colored skirt and blouse. She knew she wouldn't mind getting dirty. Then, taking Rose's small hand in her own, a first, she led the child out of the house and towards the crumbling wall of the forgotten garden. The old wooden door groaned in protest as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was still and damp, thick with the smell of earth and decay. Sunlight struggled to pierce the overgrown canopy. It was a daunting sight. "It doesn't look like much now," Ilara said, her voice soft as she looked down at Rose. The child was clinging to her hand, her eyes wide as she took in the wild, tangled space. "But I think there are still flowers sleeping under all these weeds. I thought we could try to wake them up. Would you like to help?" Rose did not answer, but she did not pull her hand away. Ilara started small. She chose a patch of earth near the entrance, a spot where a hardy, tenacious bit of lavender was being choked by nettles. She knelt on the damp ground, ignoring the ruin of her skirt, and began to work, her gloved hands gently but firmly clearing the weeds. She explained what she was doing to Rose in a low, calm voice, talking about the roots and the soil and the sun. For a long time, Rose just watched, a silent observer. But then, Ilara uncovered a small, tightly curled snail. She showed it to Rose, letting the creature crawl onto her glove. A flicker of interest crossed the child's face. She reached out a hesitant finger and gently touched the snail's shell. It was a start, a tiny, fragile beginning. They spent an hour in the garden that first day, and every day thereafter. Ilara did the heavy work, pulling ivy from the walls, clearing the choked fountain, and patiently reclaiming the buried paths, one stone at a time. Rose remained her silent companion. She would sit on the stone bench, which Ilara had cleared, her doll Lily clutched in her lap, and watch. Ilara never pushed her. She would simply talk, narrating her work, telling stories about the flowers she hoped to find. She learned from old Silas that the garden had been designed by the first Duchess, Isabella, and that each rose had a meaning. It was a language of flowers, a silent conversation. Slowly, tentatively, Rose began to participate. At first, it was just by bringing Ilara a tool she'd set down. Then, one afternoon, as Ilara was struggling to untangle a particularly stubborn briar, Rose quietly pointed to a flash of color hidden beneath it. It was a snowdrop, a single perfect white bell pushing its way through the cold earth. A tiny beacon of resilience. "Oh, Rose, look!" Ilara exclaimed, her voice filled with genuine delight. "You found the first flower." A small, shy smile touched Rose's lips. It was the first time Ilara had seen it, and it was as precious and as hopeful as the flower itself. The work was slow and arduous. Her hands, once soft and pale, became calloused and perpetually smudged with dirt. Mrs. Davies and the other staff watched her with a mixture of disapproval and grudging curiosity. This was not how a duchess was supposed to behave, but no one stopped her. The Duke was away on business in London, and in his absence a strange, quiet anarchy took hold. Ilara, the quiet, biddable duchess, was carving out her own small kingdom of dirt and weeds. As the weeks passed, a transformation began. The garden, under her patient care, began to breathe again. Cleared of weeds, the rich, dark soil was revealed. The skeletons of the rose bushes, once pruned of their dead wood, began to show tiny green buds. Ilara, with Silas's gruff guidance, planted new seeds, forget-me-nots and pansies and sweet williams, in the reclaimed beds. And as the garden changed, so did Rose. The little girl who had been a silent shadow now followed Ilara everywhere, a small sturdy trowel in her hand. She was still quiet, but her silence was different now. It was a comfortable, companionable silence. She began to ask questions, her small voice a surprise every time. "Why is the soil wet? Will the roses be red? Did Mama like the yellow ones?" Ilara answered each question honestly and simply. "Yes, your mother loved all the flowers, but Silas told me the yellow roses were her very favorite." She spoke of Isabella not as a ghost or a rival, but as the woman who had first loved this garden, as someone they could honor with their work. She was tilling not just the soil, but the fallow ground of the child's grief. One afternoon, as they were planting daffodil bulbs along a newly cleared path, Rose looked up at Ilara, her face serious. "Mama used to sing to the flowers." Ilara's heart clenched. "Did she? That sounds lovely. I'm afraid I don't have a very good singing voice." "You could try," Rose said, with the simple, unwavering logic of a child. And so, in the middle of the forgotten garden, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of the future, Ilara began to hum. It was a simple lullaby her own mother used to sing to her. She felt self-conscious at first, but Rose's quiet, focused attention gave her courage. She sang softly to the sleeping bulbs, to the budding roses, and to the sad little girl who was slowly, miraculously coming back to life. She was so absorbed in her task, in the simple rhythm of digging and planting and humming, that she did not hear the footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She did not notice the tall, dark figure standing in the doorway of the garden, watching them. It was only when Rose suddenly fell silent and scrambled to hide behind Ilara's skirts that she looked up. Alistair was home. He stood framed in the arched gateway, a figure of stark, black-clad authority against the soft greens and browns of the garden. He was travel-stained and weary, but his presence was as overwhelming as ever. His arctic grey eyes swept over the scene, taking in the cleared paths, the pruned roses that turned earth. He looked at the dirt on Ilara's dress, the smudge of soil on her cheek, the trowel still clutched in her hand. Then his gaze dropped to the small, trembling child hiding behind her. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt like a trespasser caught in the act. She had disobeyed a direct order, however unspoken. This garden was a memorial, and she had disturbed it. She braced herself for the cold fury, the dismissive command to cease this foolishness. She rose slowly to her feet, placing a protective hand on Rose's head, and met his gaze. She would not apologize. She had done nothing wrong. She had brought life back to a place that was dying. Alistair's expression was impossible to read. The hard lines of his face seemed to have deepened. He looked from Ilara to his daughter, and for a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment, something flickered in the depths of his eyes. It was not anger. It was not pleasure. It was something akin to stunned disbelief. He did not speak to her. Instead, he addressed the child still hiding behind her. "Rose." His voice was rough, as if from disuse. Rose peeked out from behind Ilara. "Come here," he said. It was not a gentle request, but it was not a harsh command either. It was simply a statement. Rose looked up at Ilara, her violet eyes wide with uncertainty. Ilara gave a small, encouraging nod. Slowly, hesitantly, Rose stepped away from the protection of Ilara's skirts and walked towards her father. Alistair crouched down, an awkward, unpracticed movement for a man so large. He brought himself to his daughter's level, a thing Ilara had never seen him do. He looked at her, really looked at her, and then his gaze fell to the small, earth-stained hand she held clenched at her side. "You have dirt on your hand," he said, his voice flat. Ilara's breath caught. It sounded like an accusation. But then he reached out and, with a startlingly gentle touch, used his thumb to wipe a smudge of soil from his daughter's cheek. He did not smile. His expression remained severe. But the gesture itself was a revelation. It was the first act of simple, uncomplicated paternal tenderness Ilara had ever witnessed from him. He looked back at Ilara, his gaze lingering on her for a long moment. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. Ilara could feel the blush rising in her cheeks under his intense scrutiny. Finally he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Dinner will be in the main dining hall tonight, for all of us." Then he stood, took Rose's hand, and walked away, leaving Ilara alone in the transformed garden, her heart beating a wild, unsteady rhythm. It was not praise, it was not forgiveness, but it was a change. It was a crack in the ice. It was a glimmer of something she had not dared to hope for. The dinner was an excruciatingly tense affair. The grand dining hall, which could comfortably seat 50, felt cavernous and empty, with only the three of them. Alistair sat at the head of the long, polished table, Ilara at the opposite end, and Rose perched between them, looking small and lost. An army of footmen moved silently, serving course after course of food that Ilara could not taste. Alistair did not speak, but his presence was a palpable weight in the room. Ilara found herself acutely aware of him, the way his large hands held his wine glass, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the austere set of his jaw. He was no longer just a cold, distant figure. He was the man who had wiped dirt from his daughter's cheek. He was a puzzle she was beginning to feel a desperate need to solve. After that night, things did not so much thaw as shift, like the groaning of a glacier. Alistair did not join them in the garden again, but he no longer forbade it. Sometimes Ilara would look up from her work and see him watching from a window in his study. He never acknowledged her, but she knew he was there. He was observing. He began to take dinner with them every evening. The conversations were stilted, often consisting of little more than Rose offering a simple report of her day. "We found a worm, Papa," or "Ilara taught me the name of the white roses." Alistair would listen, his face unreadable, and respond with a simple nod or a monosyllabic, "I see." But he was present. He was there. For Rose, it was a miracle. Ilara's own position in the household began to solidify. The staff, seeing that the Duke had not banished her for her horticultural transgressions, began to treat her with a new, grudging respect. Mrs. Davies even offered her a cup of tea one morning, a gesture so unexpected it felt like a peace treaty. Ilara was no longer a ghost floating through the corridors. She was the Duchess, the woman who had made the little girl smile and the master of the house sit down to dinner. Their fragile new equilibrium was shattered by the arrival of a carriage one blustery afternoon. A raven-haired woman, exquisitely dressed in the latest London fashion, swept into the hall as if she owned it. This was Lady Beatrice, Alistair's cousin, a woman who, Ilara soon learned, had been a close confidant of the first Duchess. "Alistair, darling." Beatrice's voice was high and musical, but with an underlying edge of steel. She embraced the Duke, who stiffened at her touch. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, then fell upon Ilara. "And you must be the new addition. How quaint." She surveyed Ilara's simple dress and the lingering traces of garden soil under her fingernails, with a look of undisguised disdain. Beatrice had arrived for an extended visit, and she made it her mission to undermine Ilara at every turn. She was a master of the subtle insult, the backhanded compliment. "Oh, you're letting Rose run wild in the dirt? Isabella was so very particular about keeping her pristine. But I suppose times change." Or, "That dreary grey dress is so practical, my dear, very fitting for the country." She treated Blackwood Manor as her own, countermanding Ilara's instructions to the staff and filling the house with her loud, brittle laughter. She spoke constantly of Isabella, painting a picture of a perfect, ethereal creature whom Ilara could never hope to emulate. She was deliberately and methodically trying to erase Ilara, to reduce her back to the insignificant ghost she had been upon her arrival. Worst of all, she tried to drive a wedge between Ilara and Rose. She would appear in the garden with expensive, useless dolls from London, trying to lure Rose away from her digging and planting. "Come now, darling, let's leave the grubby work to the Duchess and play ladies inside." But Rose, to Ilara's profound relief, would not be swayed. She would politely thank her father's cousin for the gift, then turn back to Ilara, her loyalty unspoken but absolute. The garden had become their sanctuary, and Beatrice was not welcome in it. The conflict came to a head during a week of relentless, driving rain that kept everyone trapped indoors. The oppressive weather seemed to magnify the tension in the house. One morning, Rose woke with a fever. At first it seemed a simple childhood ailment, but by evening the fever had spiked, and Rose was delirious, crying out for her mother in her sleep. Ilara sent for the doctor, but the storm had washed out the roads. They were trapped, isolated, with a very sick child. Beatrice was worse than useless. "Children are always getting ill," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand, complaining that the child's cries were giving her a headache. She retreated to her rooms with a book and a bottle of sherry. Miss Albright, the governess, dissolved into a puddle of panicked tears. It was Ilara who took charge. She had nursed her brother Thomas through a bout of scarlet fever years ago, and she knew what to do. She sent Anna for cool water and linens, and she sat by Rose's bedside, bathing her forehead, her voice a low, constant murmur of reassurance. She was so focused on the child that she did not hear Alistair enter the room. He stood in the doorway, his face a stark white mask of fear. It was the first raw, unguarded emotion she had ever seen on him. The sight of his sick daughter had shattered his icy control. "What is happening?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "It's a fever," Ilara said calmly, not taking her eyes off Rose. "We need to keep her cool. The doctor cannot get through." He strode to the bedside, his helplessness radiating from him like a physical force. He was a man used to being in control, a man who could command fortunes and bend men to his will, but against this, he was powerless. He reached out a hand as if to touch Rose's forehead, then drew it back, afraid of his own rough touch. "What can I do?" he asked, the words wrenched from him. "Stay with her," Ilara said simply. "Let her know you are here." And so began a long, desperate vigil. For 2 days and 2 nights, they did not leave the nursery. They worked together, a silent, efficient team. He held Rose's hand while Ilara changed the cool compresses. She coaxed spoonfuls of broth between the child's lips while he read aloud from a book of fairy tales. His deep voice, a steady, comforting rumble in the quiet room. They barely spoke. There was no need. In the shared primal fear for a child's life, all artifice was stripped away. She was not the duchess he had hired, and he was not the cold master of the house. They were just 2 people, bound together by their love for the small, fragile girl burning with fever in the bed between them. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. The storm had passed, and weak, watery sunlight streamed through the nursery window. Rose woke up, her eyes clear, and whispered, "I'm thirsty." The relief was so immense it was dizzying. Ilara felt tears she hadn't even known were there prick her eyes. She looked across the bed at Alistair. He was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. She went to him and, without thinking, placed a hand on his back. He flinched at her touch, then stilled. He did not pull away. He slowly raised his head, and she saw that his face was wet with tears. The great, formidable Duke of Blackwood was weeping. She looked so much like her mother just then, he rasped, his voice thick with unshed grief. "When she was ill." He did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. The shared crisis had unlocked something in him, a door to the past that had been sealed for 2 long years. He looked at Ilara, his arctic eyes filled with a pain so profound it stole her breath, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the story of Blackwood Manor was far more tragic than she had ever imagined. The days following Rose's recovery were strange and quiet. A new, fragile intimacy existed between Ilara and Alistair, born from the shared terror and relief of the long vigil. Beatrice, having made herself scarce during the crisis, found the altered atmosphere of the house unwelcoming and departed for London with a flurry of excuses and a final venomous glare for Ilara. Her absence was a relief, like the lifting of a great weight. Alistair retreated back into himself, but the silence was different now. It was no longer a cold, hard wall between them, but something more porous, filled with unspoken thoughts. Ilara would find him watching her, his expression thoughtful, almost searching. The dynamic had shifted. She had proven herself not just a capable duchess, but a compassionate partner in a crisis. She had cared for his child, she had seen him weep. They could not go back to being strangers. One evening, another storm rolled in from the moors, rattling the window panes and sending drafts whispering through the long corridors. The raw power of the wind and rain seemed to mirror the turmoil that had been brewing in the house. For weeks, unable to settle, Ilara sought refuge in the library. The scent of old paper and leather was a comfort to her, a constant in a world that had been anything but. She was curled in a large armchair near the fire, a book forgotten in her lap, when the door opened and Alistair walked in. He stopped when he saw her, a flicker of surprise on his face. He was holding a decanter of brandy. "I did not mean to disturb you," he said, his voice low. "You're not," she replied softly. "Please, the fire is large enough for two." He hesitated for a moment, then walked to the fireplace and poured himself a drink. He did not sit, but stood leaning against the mantelpiece, staring into the flames. The firelight cast flickering shadows across his face, accentuating the harsh lines and the deep-seated exhaustion. He looked like a man at war with himself. "The storm," he began, his voice rough. "It was a night like this." Ilara's heart stilled. She knew instinctively that this was it, the moment the walls would finally come down. She said nothing, simply waiting, giving him the space and the silence to speak. He took a long swallow of his brandy, the glass trembling slightly in his hand. "Isabella, my wife, she loved the rain. She said it made the roses grow." He gave a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "She was with child, our son William. She was near her time. We were returning from a dinner at a neighbor's estate. I was driving the carriage myself. I knew the road. I had driven it 1,000 times." His gaze was fixed on the fire, but Ilara knew he was not seeing the flames. He was seeing the past, replaying a memory that had been burned into his soul. "She was laughing," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "She was telling me about the names she had chosen. The rain was coming down in sheets. I should have stopped. I should have waited for it to pass. But I was arrogant, impatient. I wanted to be home." He paused, his knuckles white as he gripped his glass. "A branch had fallen across the road, hidden by the dark and the rain. I saw it too late. The horses shied. The carriage, it overturned. It all happened so fast." He closed his eyes, his face contorting in a mask of pure agony. "I was thrown clear, a few bruises, nothing more. But Isabella, she was trapped. The doctor said, he said the impact induced the birth. She delivered our son there, in the wreckage, in the mud and the rain. He lived for less than an hour." A strangled sob escaped him, a sound of such profound despair that Ilara felt a physical pain in her own chest. "She lingered for a day," he went on, his voice now flat and devoid of all emotion, the voice of a man who has recited his own damnation 1,000 times in the dark. "She held him, she named him, and then she was gone. I killed them, my wife and my son, my impatience, my pride. It killed them both." The confession hung in the air between them, stark and terrible. This was the source of the coldness, the reason for the locked wing, the neglect of the garden, the emotional distance from his own daughter. It was not just grief, it was guilt. A guilt so monumental it had hollowed him out, leaving only a shell. He finally looked at her, his eyes blazing with self-loathing. "The West Wing, that was their nursery. I had it decorated myself. I couldn't bear to look at it. So I locked the door. I ordered the gardeners to abandon her garden because every rose was a reminder of what I had lost, of what I had destroyed. I tried to wall off the past, to bury it, and I swore I would never allow myself to feel anything again, to love anything again, because everything I touch, I destroy." He expected her to recoil in horror, to pity him, to condemn him. He had laid the ugliest, most painful part of himself bare. But Ilara did none of those things. She rose from her chair and went to him, her heart aching with a wave of compassion so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She looked into his tormented eyes and saw not a monster, but a man, drowning in a pain he felt he deserved. She reached out and gently took the brandy glass from his trembling hand, setting it on the mantelpiece. Then she took his large, cold hands in her own small, warm ones. "It was an accident, Alistair," she said, her voice soft but firm, using his given name for the first time. "A terrible, tragic accident, not an act of malice, not a failure of love." "I was driving," he insisted, his voice breaking. "Yes," she said, her grip on his hands tightening. "You were, and you have carried that burden alone for 2 years. You have punished yourself in this cold, silent house. You have honored Isabella and William with every moment of your suffering, but you have another child, a living, breathing little girl who needs her father. You haven't destroyed everything. Look at Rose. She is resilient. She is hopeful. She is waiting for you." She saw the conflict in his eyes, the desperate desire to believe her warring with the guilt that had been his only companion for so long. He looked down at their joined hands, at her small fingers wrapped around his. "You," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You came into this house. You tended the garden. You cared for my child. You are not afraid of the ghosts here." "I am not afraid of you," she corrected gently. The air between them crackled with a new and terrifying energy. The distance that had defined their marriage had vanished, burned away by the heat of his confession and the warmth of her compassion. He was no longer the cold Duke of Blackwood, and she was no longer the woman he had hired. They were just a man and a woman standing before a fire on a stormy night, their shared past and uncertain future hanging in the balance. He raised a hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment before they gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was tentative, questioning, as if he were touching a flame to see if it would burn. It sent a shiver through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Ilara," he breathed, his voice thick with a longing that seemed to be pulled from the very depths of his soul. And in that moment, she knew. She knew that she had, against all odds, against all reason, fallen in love with this broken, beautiful man. The knowledge was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. The storm outside raged on, but inside the library, in the circle of firelight, a different kind of storm was just beginning to break. The turning point had arrived, not with a crash of thunder, but with a quiet touch and the whisper of a name. That night in the library changed everything. The confession, once spoken, could not be taken back. The shared vulnerability had forged a new, tentative bond between them, as fragile and as precious as the first snowdrop Rose had found in the garden. Alistair did not retreat into his study the next day. Instead, he sought Ilara out. He found her where he always found her now, in the rose garden. The sun was shining, the air washed clean by the storm. The garden was vibrant with new life, the colors of the crocuses and daffodils a vivid testament to her work. He did not speak at first, simply stood beside her as she pruned a climbing rose, the thorns catching on her gloves. The silence was comfortable, companionable. "Silas tells me you have a gift," he said finally, his voice still carrying the rough edge of last night's emotions. "Silas is a flatterer," Ilara replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "He is simply pleased someone is willing to do the weeding." "No," Alistair said, his gaze sweeping over the transformed garden. "It is more than that. You bring things back to life." His eyes met hers, and the implication was clear. He was not just talking about the flowers. From that day forward, he began to join her. He would spend an hour each afternoon in the garden, at first just watching, then fetching tools or helping to move a heavy stone. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant. They worked side by side, finding a rhythm in the shared, simple tasks of tilling and planting. In the quiet earth of the garden, they began to cultivate something new between them. He started spending time with Rose, real time. He took her to the stables and lifted her onto the back of a gentle old pony. He sat with her on the floor of the nursery, helping her build lopsided towers with her wooden blocks. He even allowed Ilara to coax him into a game of hide-and-seek in the garden, his large frame comically failing to hide behind a slender sapling, to Rose's shrieking delight. Laughter, a sound that had been absent from Blackwood Manor for 2 long years, began to echo in its halls. The staff, seeing the change in their master, began to smile. The entire house seemed to exhale, shedding the heavy cloak of grief it had worn for so long. Ilara found her own heart healing alongside his. The quiet, lonely girl who had arrived at Blackwood out of desperation was blossoming. She was no longer just the Duchess, a role she was playing. She was Ilara, a woman who had found purpose, and perhaps even love, in the most unlikely of places. One evening, weeks later, the air was warm with the promise of summer. The first of Isabella's yellow roses had opened, its petals the color of rich cream, its fragrance sweet and poignant. Alistair found Ilara in the garden at dusk, standing before the rose bush, her expression thoughtful. "It's beautiful," she said as he came to stand beside her. "Isabella planted this one the year we were married," he said, his voice quiet. He no longer spoke his late wife's name with pain, but with a gentle, wistful fondness. "She would have liked you, I think. She would have loved what you've done here." It was the highest compliment he could have given her. He was not asking her to replace his first wife, but acknowledging that she had her own unique place in his life, in his home. He was integrating the past with the present. He turned to face her, the last rays of the setting sun casting a golden glow on his strong features. The severity had softened, the harsh lines eased by his tentative smiles, the arctic grey of his eyes had warmed, like a frozen sea beginning to thaw. "Ilara," he began, his voice low and serious, "when I brought you here, I made you a promise. I promised you a life of cold comfort, a marriage of convenience. I told you my heart was not part of the transaction." He took her hands in his. They were no longer the calloused, dirt-stained hands of a gardener, but the hands of the woman he loved, and they fit perfectly in his. "I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a fool. I thought my heart was buried with Isabella and William. I thought this house and everything in it was a tomb, but you walked in and you opened the windows, you let the sun in, you tended to my daughter, and you tended to me with a patience and a compassion I did not deserve." He raised one of her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You did not just bring a garden back to life, Ilara. You brought me back to life. My marriage to you was meant to be a contract, a duty, but it has become the single greatest blessing of my life. I love you with a depth of feeling I thought I was no longer capable of. I love your strength, your kindness, your stubborn refusal to let this house and its master languish in the dark." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She had dreamed of hearing these words, had hoped for them in the secret corners of her heart, but to hear them spoken here in the garden that had been the backdrop to their slow, quiet courtship was more than she could have ever imagined. "Oh, Alistair," she whispered, her own voice trembling. I never dared to hope." "Hope now," he urged, his gaze intense, pleading. "Tell me it is not a one-sided madness. Tell me there is a chance that the Duchess of Blackwood might feel something more than duty for her broken, foolish husband." She laughed through her tears, a sound of pure happiness. "There is nothing broken about you, Alistair Beaumont, only a heart that has been wounded and is finally healing." She reached up, her hands framing his face, her thumbs tracing the strong line of his jaw. "I love you too. I think I have loved you for a very long time." His face broke into a real, unguarded smile, a smile so radiant it transformed him. It was the smile of a man set free. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of polite affection or tentative exploration. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of desperate, joyful love. It was a kiss that sealed the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. It was a promise of shared dawns, of laughter in the hallways, of a future built not on the ashes of the past, but on the rich, fertile ground of a love that had, against all odds, taken root and bloomed in the fragrant twilight of the rose garden, surrounded by the ghosts of the past who were now finally at peace. The Duke and his Duchess began their life anew. The contract was fulfilled, but it had been replaced by something infinitely more precious: a covenant of the heart. A year later, the transformation of Blackwood Manor was complete. It was no longer a fortress of grief, but a home filled with light and warmth. The heavy draperies had been thrown back, the dusty furniture polished to a high sheen, and bowls of fresh flowers from the now thriving garden graced every room. The most significant change was the reopening of the West Wing. It had been Ilara's idea. She had approached Alistair one evening, her suggestion gentle but firm. "The past is a part of you, Alistair, a part of this house. We shouldn't keep it locked away in the dark. Let's honor them. Let's let the light in." Together they had unlocked the door. The air inside was stale, the furniture draped in white sheets like slumbering ghosts. But it was not a frightening place. It was simply a room that had been waiting. They did not erase what it had been. They repurposed it. The room intended for their son, William, became a bright, airy schoolroom for Rose. The nursery became a family sitting room, a place for reading stories by the fire. They kept a single, beautiful portrait of Isabella on the mantelpiece, a smiling, vibrant woman with kind eyes. She was not a spectre to be feared, but a cherished memory, a part of the family's story. Rose, who had only known her mother through a haze of sadness, now learned about her through Alistair's fond stories. She learned about her mother's love for yellow roses, her beautiful singing voice, her infectious laugh. Alistair, for his part, was a new man. The cold, forbidding Duke was gone, replaced by a husband who delighted in his wife and a father who doted on his daughter. He had turned over much of the day-to-day management of his business affairs to a trusted associate, choosing instead to spend his time at home. He and Ilara were inseparable, their partnership a true meeting of minds and hearts. They rode out together across the moors, managed the estate as a team, and spent their evenings in the library, not in silence, but in comfortable conversation. Their love, once declared, had deepened and matured, settling into a rhythm of quiet affection and unwavering mutual respect. Alistair, who had once sworn off all sentiment, was now an openly affectionate husband. He would bring Ilara a single perfect rose from the garden or pull her into his arms for a kiss in the middle of a sun-drenched corridor, much to the delight of the smiling staff. Rose, nurtured by the love of two devoted parents, was a happy, chattering, confident little girl. The solemn, silent child was a distant memory. She spent her days covered in mud from the garden, paint from the schoolroom, and jam from the kitchen, and her laughter was the house's constant, joyful music. One bright summer afternoon, Ilara stood on the terrace, a contented smile on her face, as she watched Alistair and Rose playing on the lawn below. He was chasing her, his long legs comically mismatched against her small, scampering ones, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. He caught her and swung her up into his arms, her dark hair flying, and for a moment they were both suspended in a perfect moment of pure joy. Alistair looked up and saw Ilara watching them. His smile widened, a smile filled with a love so profound it still made her heart ache. He set Rose down and came to the terrace, taking Alara's hand and pulling her into the circle of his arm. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice a low murmur against her hair. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her gaze taking in the vibrant garden, the happy child, the strong, warm man beside her. "I was thinking about the day I arrived," she said softly. "How cold and empty this place felt, how cold and empty I felt." He tightened his arm around her. "And I was the cause of that emptiness. I can never apologize enough for the bargain I forced upon you." She turned in his arms to face him, her hands resting on his chest. "Don't," she said, her expression serious. "Never apologize for it. That bargain brought me here. It brought me to Rose. It brought me to you. It was the path, however cold and dark, that led me home." He looked down at her, his love for her shining in his eyes. "Then I will thank it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will thank whatever desperate, foolish impulse led me to your father's door that day. It was the best decision I ever made." He kissed her then, a deep, loving kiss filled with the promise of a lifetime of shared summer afternoons. As she melted into his embrace, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that their story was not a fairy tale of a dark prince saved by a patient princess. It was something far more real and far more beautiful. It was a story of two broken people who, in the patient, quiet work of tending a neglected garden, had learned how to tend to each other, and in doing so had found a way to let the love and the light back in. Dear listener, how often do we encounter a closed door in our own lives or in the lives of those we care about? A heart that has been locked away due to grief, a dream that has been abandoned because of failure, a part of ourselves that we deem too broken to ever see the light of day. We see the overgrown garden, the silent rooms, the fortress built of pain, and we believe it to be a permanent state. We think the only option is to walk away, to respect the do not enter sign that grief and guilt have posted. But Ilara's story whispers a different truth. It reminds us that healing is often a quiet, patient, and sometimes dirty work. It doesn't happen with a single grand gesture, but with the steady daily commitment to showing up. It's in the small, seemingly insignificant acts. Clearing one weed at a time, speaking softly to a child who has forgotten how to smile, sitting in shared silence through a long, difficult night. It is the courage to bring a lamp into a dark room, not to expose its mess, but simply to offer a little light. We may not all be tasked with restoring a ducal garden or melting a frozen heart, but we are all faced with opportunities for this kind of patient love. It might be with a friend going through a hard time, a family member lost in their own sorrow, or even with ourselves. It's the choice to see the potential for life beneath the neglect, to believe in the resilience of roots that have gone dormant but are not dead. It's understanding that sometimes the most profound act of love is not to demand that a locked door be opened, but to simply sit outside it, tending the garden, and patiently waiting for the person inside to feel safe enough to turn the key. So, the next time you encounter a locked door, ask yourself, is there a garden nearby that needs tending? You may find that in bringing something else back to life, you create the very key you were looking for. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing for more tales of love, loss, and the quiet resilience of the human heart. Your support helps us continue to bring these stories to you.